Okay, welcome back, designers. Welcome to the third and final lecture on typography. So today we're talking about typographic hierarchy, which is how you express, how you organize the content of your design, which basically means which elements do you emphasize and which ones do you subordinate. So a visual hierarchy helps the reader to scan the text. It helps them to know where to enter, where to start reading, where to stop reading. And it allows them to pick and choose from the various offerings that you might have on a page. That's if you have a more complicated page, like, for example, this example here. So typographic decisions are based largely on what we call hierarchies of information. We've already used the term hierarchy in here before. It just basically means that some elements are more important than others. And the more important elements should be designed or treated in such a way to make them stand out more than less important elements. It's a fairly simple concept. It's a fancy word for a simple concept. So just the most important stuff stands out most, and the second, and then down the line to the other elements. And there's lots of ways to do that. So I'm simplifying it. There's lots of ways to add emphasis to things, which is what we've been really talking about since the beginning of the class. But now we're looking a little bit more at typographic. So simply this example here, we have the main headline, and the main paragraph, and then we have subsections. And so this has been done for us, but how do we know what are the visual cues that the designer uses to tell us, for example, which one is the main headline? Obviously, it's common typographic diseases. How do we know that? Well, it's placed first, which gives it primary focus. Secondly, if it's not larger, I don't think it's larger than the other fonts. I think it's the same, but it's set in all caps. And there's a big space below it and the next paragraph of text. So it has very generous air around all sides of it, so that it really stands out. Next is the main text. How do we know that's the most important? Well, the most obvious is that it's next in order, and we read left to right, top to bottom. But I guess the subsections are where we get into the next decisions. Like, how are we going to show that those are subordinate to the main text? That basically they are categories. They're bullet points, more or less, of the main text. And this designer does it by indenting. And also making the first word of each one of those bullets in all caps. So he sets that information apart from the headline and the main text. So all these treatments are done to help guide you where to look. We know that we've got a headline, we have main text, and we have the bullets, which are a subsidiary, so to speak, of the main text. Here is another solution for the same quote problem. Because there are endless ways to express a hierarchy in a document. This is just another way of showing it. Here we do not have the indenting of the bullet points. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's an outdenting, I think I'm making that word up, and a tabbing over of all the other information. So it more or less achieves the same ends, although I would say that this, in a way, highlights the four items, which are very funny: typophilia, typophobia, typochondria, and typothermia. So if the client, for example, saw this and said, "Well, I like that, but I would like those four subsections to jump out a little bit more," the designer might go home and do this, and then show them that. All right. So let's compare the two of these and see how they are treated differently or what tools the designer uses to break up the information. So in both of these, left and right, it's the same information. We see that there are three different sections. Okay, just macro view. We have divisions of angels, ruling body of clergy, parts of text. So we have three different, and it's clear in both of them that underneath each of these headings are four different bullets. Okay, they are each a division of one of the three sections. How does the designer, which one of the things the designer does to show that these are 3 sections? Well, since this is a video lecture and not a class, I will have to tell you the answer. The use of space. There's space above ruling body of clergy, number 2, and above parts of text, number 3. And that immediately shows us that space separates. So remember Gestalt, we read those things as a group because they are close together. And thus, if we put a space between them, we don't read them as the same thing. So space, very, very important here. Both examples use that. Now, where they change or they're different is much like the last examples we have. One on the left, they're tabbed over and they use a Roman numeral on the far left, and on the right, they tab in the bullet points. They're not left aligned with each heading. The one on the left uses letters for bullet points. The one on the right doesn't. So they both achieve the same thing, but they are different methods. There we go. There's all the answers I just gave you. Okay, so we use more than typographic elements to establish a hierarchy. A cue, like I just suggested with the use of space above each of the 3 sections. Use of space, whether it's indent or line spacing or placement, or use of a graphic or a consistent color. There are infinite variations you can use to help the reader understand what is more or less important. Here, some of the things you're using here is color. Although that is a color image, if you take the orange out of it, it's fairly monochromatic, so that the word volcano, the large W in the body copy, and the lava are the 3 red things, and those sort of pop out from everything else. And those are kind of the most important things: the headline, the beginning of the copy, and the picture. So the reader's eye just goes boom, boom, boom. Who wrote it is important, who photographed it, fine, magazine, fine, but not as important as those 3 things. So the designer was able, with simply using a color, to make those elements pop out and be more important in their hierarchy. They use a lot of space above the headline, the volcano next door, and some below it as well, to set off that that is the headline. They use the size of the type and the inclusion of color as well to make the headline stand out more. Because the headline is more important. All right, hopefully you see where I'm going here. So the elements you use to create your hierarchy should be used consistently across your design. This example here, you can see where this is a listing of various restaurants in the Baltimore area, I believe. Mixture of fonts, as we've seen in an earlier example in another lecture, but the locations, a great example is the use of color. The location, Canton, Fulton, Harbor East, are all done in green. So if you were visiting Baltimore, say, and you're looking for a restaurant in, let's say you're staying in Canton, you're only interested in the restaurants in Canton, you can just scan this page to look for the green and find what they're looking for. So it's a great way of, you're signaling to the reader right away, and we take this for granted. Think about next time you go onto Amazon or go to some website you use very often. How do you know where to go? Why do you know where to go? Besides, or try a new site and see if you know where to go. Because on Amazon and such, you're used to it by now. You know all the visual cues. But I'm curious to have you start to think about why you're doing what you do, because I think we do a lot of it subconsciously. So in addition to the use of green, we have the larger and bolder name of the actual restaurant. Within the paragraph itself, the main text there, they bold food and drink to kind of break up the copy more. It gives your eye somewhere to look. Take those bold faces out of there for a second. Food and drink, service, ambiance, insider's tip. You're just looking at a sea of text. You're looking at 20 lines of text. And it's like floating in the sea without something to hold on to. But when you put food and drink, service, ambiance, insider's tip, use those, the reader can go right to them. And therefore they can limit how much time they're spending looking for something. They get their information, they're in and out. And people that's what they want. They want it to be user-friendly. Here's an example of this red centered type. It's a very different kind of information. We know that because A, it's red, B, it's a different size, C, it's centered, D, it has a headline unlike the rest of this text. So it's a call out. We call that a call out or a sidebar. But those are the reasons why we know it is. Plus the column width is different than the other column widths. So those are all things the designer is doing to say, hey, that red thing there, that's not the same as those other listings. It's like something different. So why don't you take a look at this when you have a moment? So considering the relationships amongst things is key to a hierarchy, because in order to emphasize one thing, you're going to de-emphasize the other one and vice versa. This is just a little graphic standard from, I'm not sure what magazine this is, but this is the table of contents, and it just kind of breaks out various elements that are on the table of contents. You can see how each of these elements is treated aesthetically in a different way to show that it is a different kind of information. The size, the weight of type, the position on the page, and the dynamic between the elements are all things that the designer has considered. We've already seen font families and the different weights, variations within the family. But I guess the point I have in showing this again is when you were designing something like a layout like this, pick a font family that has a lot of variety in it so that you don't have to go outside of the family in order to do your design. Keep your choices limited on a page to maybe 3 fonts per layout. This might technically be 3 or less fonts, but when you start treating the fonts differently, like for example, the Rolling Stone interview and the type below Al Gore's name are probably the same font. It's hard for me to tell from here, but the spacing is so different that it almost seems like a different font. Same thing with the main copy on the left that's italicized and the one on the right column that is not italicized. It might be the same copy, just an italic version, but it starts to read like another font, and I think this is a good example of getting too busy. I hate to criticize someone who did a design for Rolling Stone, but I do think this is borderline of too many things going on. You've got the Rolling Stone interview, Al Gore's name, the subhead, then the first paragraph, or the first section, second section, and then you have the author's name in that little box. Less is more. If you're going to call attention to something, try to use as few means possible. You don't need to bold something and italicize it, or or bold something and underline it, or underline and cap it, or cap it and bold it. Usually one signal is all the reader needs to know that this information is important. Match your typographic treatments to the nature of your product. This is a high-end product, so there's a sense of simplicity, relaxation. The viewer is not bombarded by too much information. It's a very clear hierarchy of the name of the product, which is an olive oil, and then, what's it say? Estate bottled, a little tiny text, and then what it actually is, the extra virgin olive oil, and then the translation in English. So it's simple, it's straightforward, it doesn't make you work too hard. I should have showed you that before. Harmony and elegance. Careful mixture of caps and lowercase. There's actually a mix of serif and sans serif in this as well. But it all melds together very nicely because the designer has chosen very carefully what to use and is not overcrowded or overburdened the viewer. Make sure when you're choosing font or a treatment to do a subhead or a sub-subhead or a text inside of a graph to make it different than the other elements on the page. Sometimes if things are not different enough, the audience is not going to pick up on what you're doing, and it just winds up looking kind of junky. I saw an example of this, I think, in the last lecture, where there wasn't just not enough of a difference. And so, what's the point? Very big difference between the giant type on the left and the smaller type on the right. Although the word knowledge in white on the lower right still connects to the giant word knowledge in the upper left. So there is a connection. although they are very different size. So that's a consistency that they're the same font, but the size and the color is very different. So the science of color. There's a lot to be said about this layout, but I'm mainly focusing on the science of color. Now, as a designer, you can type this into Illustrator, start playing around with it. The first one is kind of the most obvious thing to do. It's not the best solution, but that's where you would start, or perhaps make it all lowercase. And then you're thinking, that's a lot of words for someone to take in. How can I simplify this? Always think about how you can simplify it. The and of is far less important than science and color, so I'll make those upper and lowercase. And then the next one, I'm going to take it one step farther and make them upper and lowercase and not all caps, and also make them much smaller. Now the words science and color really pop out. And what they finally did is go one step farther. Well, they actually made their science and color even larger, took a step back and made it upper and lowercase, probably because it's easier to read. I would say what they chose is easier to read than my little example here. And that's how they came to that solution. So when you look at this, science and color are the two things that really pop out to you. Similarly, we have connection here between center type and the caps. The caps in The Man Who Wasn't Darwin, and then the boxed copy where the author's name is. Same caps, same tracking, so that the eye knows that this is part of the same thing. But the size difference between the two fonts clearly tells us, and the placement, that The Man Who Wasn't Darwin, the headline, is way more important than the information about the author in the box. Okay, so consistency, find those things that connect the elements in your design, but make sure that you're ordering them in a way that the audience is looking at what you want them to look at first. Color is a technique you can use. You can see where the color here, each one of these boxes is a different color, is a different kind of information. So you just scan this quickly, opening it up, and you know that immediately by looking at it. Also, the fact that it's a black and white image in the background and the use of color also, to me, says that the information in the box is probably pretty important if it's color added to it and not in the background. But that's just me. Here's another use of color. On the right, anything that's an infographic that has numbers in it is used in red, so it really jumps out from the other elements on the page. On the left, the increased, approved, all those things are what the client really wanted to have jump out to the reader. That's why they are also in red. We've already talked about this, but I have this in here because the use of just white space. If you see above the first, or below the first paragraph, before the how would you define your relationship with the country music world, that added white space just gives your eye enough of a visual break to know that this is something different and that you're taking on another morsel of information. You're not giving them an entire meal that they have to gobble down. You're breaking it up into manageable portions for someone to take in. And that, my friends, is the end of the lecture on visual or typographic hierarchy, rather. And thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next class. Do the quiz and be back here next time, homework time, for a lecture on, oh, actually, I'm not sure what the next lecture is. It'll be a surprise. I'll stop talking. Bye.